To break the journey on Friday, my wife Sue and I stopped at Chartley Moss, which is roughly halfway to Anglesey. It is a triple SI, composed mainly of peat. For those of you who remember David Bellamy, it's the kind of place where he would bounce up and down on the surface, hopefully without falling through. We were there to see a nationally scarce dragonfly, the white-faced darter, breeding mostly in Scotland now. Although it was warm and sunny, it was windy too. Consequently, the few dragons that braved the elements kept close to the ground. Slightly smaller than the common darter you might see by your garden pond, this male is black with distinctive red, orange and brown markings. And of course a white face. This is a newly emerged autenera female. The colours will get a little darker and the abdomen a little wider. The fresh wings are highly reflective and soft at this stage, needing to harden in the sunshine. I found a few mating pairs. The position they adopt is exclusive to dragons and damsels and is commonly known as the wheel. Males have a habit of flexing their wings every now and again and take the opportunity to clean. Having arrived on Anglesey, it was a short drive the following morning to South Stacks, which is an RSPB reserve. Most of the birding can be done on this western side of the reserve near the lighthouse. These steep steps down to the lighthouse afford views of the cliff face on either side. The last clip was taken from Ellis Tower, the small castle-like building in these clips, which is directly below the visitor centre and the main car park. And here we are looking to the south. Guillemots far outnumbered these razorbills, and puffins, bottom right, were harder to find. Most of the birds were to the north of the steps, with hundreds of pairs of guillemots on the cliff face and plenty of fulmars flying around. However, the birds I was wanting to see were these choughs. There are about 40 of them at South Stacks. Sue and I had walked further down the steps than the rest of the group, and were lucky to have this bird land so close. I think the majority of the group had similar close encounters later. 2024 was a good year for the choughs here, with 14 pairs fledging 23 young. They like the short grass on the cliff tops, where they use their bright red beaks to probe for beetle and moth larvae. There are thought to be about 440 pairs nationwide, with 50% on the Welsh coast, mainly around Pembrokeshire. Sue and I went back Sunday morning when I got this clip near the tower. Out of interest, Kent Wildlife Trust are reintroducing choughs to the cliffs around Dover and had their first breeding success this year. Digressing from the NarVOS trip, we had a holiday in Cornwall during October back in 2020. Sue and I walked between Lizard and Kynance Cove, having researched Cornish choughs online. The website said they could be quite confiding, but the path was full of people and the weather wasn't great. However, a couple of birds flew past us and landed close to the path near walkers, about 200 yards behind us. We rushed back, of course. Out of the breeding season, they were in a small flock of about a dozen birds, presumably 3 or 4 family groups. I stayed in a fairly tight pack for about 20 minutes, allowing myself and others to observe within 5 metres of them. Choughs started their return to Cornwall in 2001, when 3 birds were recorded at the Lizard. The chough population in Cornwall is thought to number well over 200 birds now, breeding around the southern tip of the county. 112 chicks fledged in 2023. Colour ringing was used to monitor individual birds to get an idea of how far they might travel to feed. I think the practice has ceased now. I suspect the younger birds are those without rings. They attack the ground quite vigorously and, in general, seem pretty adept at finding grubs just beneath the surface. Despite some aggressive prodding for nearly a minute, this bird had to move on, having found nothing. Some choughs have been seen feeding inland in recent years. Kennin Bay on the north coast was the next stop on Saturday, where there is a well-known tern colony. Roseate terns are bred in the past, sadly no more. There were a few black terns, which some lucky members of the group saw. The bulk of the birds were sandwich terns. They start to breed a few weeks earlier than the common and Arctic terns, which were also present. I think the young birds you can see are gulls rather than terns. We arrived at lunchtime, when bathing and preening seemed to be the main occupations. Some birds were flying over our heads and out to sea. Returning with sand eels and small fish. This one didn't seem to know what to do with its catch. The sandwich terns kept to the island, whereas some of the common and Arctic terns were happy to rest just over the barrier from the beach. Having consulted my field guides, I'm pretty sure these black-billed birds with white foreheads were non-breeding adults, in other words, birds raised last year. It was a great opportunity to sort the common terns from the Arctic, the common having longer, more orange-red beaks, with black tips, the Arctic having shorter, deeper red beaks. The deep red legs and feet are shorter and smaller too. There is an obvious difference in size between the red-billed Arctic and common and the larger black-billed sandwich terns. Our last stop of the day was Llangefni, fairly central to the island. There is a woodland reserve commonly known as the Dingle. A boardwalk guides you alongside a river for a while, eventually to a feeding station for red squirrels. We didn't have much luck, as it is a popular place and a lot of noisy people had turned up. This was as good as it got for me. Plus a patient crow and a balding robin. Walking back to our cars, we watched this grey heron at a pond formed in the river by a small dam. However, these clips are from Sunday afternoon when Sue and I returned. With fewer people, we were seeing squirrels immediately. This one was happy to eat inside the feeder for a while. A more handsome robin was present, and a young great spotted woodpecker was also taking advantage. He wasn't able to get inside the feeder, but a crack at the bottom of it was all he needed to access the food. Will, the squirrel whisperer, was a little late, but replenished the feeders and this stump as soon as he arrived. In his presence, the squirrels were a little cautious. Taking the nuts away to be consumed in private. Will was a little new to the job, trying to get the squirrels used to his appearance and voice. This one with a dodgy tail was well accustomed, but was hiding his treasures within metres of where he'd found them. And enjoyed a drink after. This jay lurked for some time, waiting its moment to raid the stump. At last, a squirrel, giving a more natural pose, above the branches where the woodpecker had been. He was keen to use the feeders too. I think Will had left by now, and the squirrels were more relaxed. They were happy to feed just below the boardwalk, right in front of us, where Will had been walking. Searching for nuts under logs, when they were still available on the ground nearby. They were more inclined to take their time on the stump now, providing a great opportunity for close-ups. Will had mentioned that grey squirrels are stopped from crossing the bridge onto the island, but some of the red squirrels had gone the other way, creating a small population on the mainland. This time, a female at the feeder. And, just before we left, probably the best clip of the day. Following an excellent day birding and an evening meal on Saturday, we took advantage of the good evening light to look for black guillemots in Holyhead Harbour. From a bridge, we spotted one that flew towards the mouth of the harbour. We drove to Fish Quay, right at the entrance. There were a few black guillemots there, but the light was fading, so we decided to return Sunday morning, before we went our separate ways. We agreed that there were at least 5 birds, and they were using the nest boxes on the harbour wall opposite. I thought they were going to mate at this point. A short while later, a boat left the harbour, and this seemed to trigger the female into action. The male was only too happy to respond. He stayed on top for about a minute. A lot of the views were distant. But they were happy to come quite close at times. Unlike the common guillemot, black guillemots are found in small scattered groups of only a few birds. They breed around much of the Scottish and Irish coasts. Anglesey is the furthest south on mainland Britain you are likely to see them. We thought this one had caught a crab, but from this clip it appears to be a small flatfish. After his meal, he bathed enthusiastically. Flapped his wings and moved on, as we all did. Sue and I had moved our base to Port Maddock, and on Monday, after a visit to the Alternative Energy Centre, we made our way to Gigrin Farm in mid-Wales, not far from the market town of Rhyadr. Red kites are fed daily at 3 p.m. through the summer, with access to the hides after 12:30 p.m. We got there just before 3 p.m, with hundreds of birds patiently circling overhead. Gigrin became the official red kite feeding station in the winter of 1992-93, when around 6 red kites were roosting on the farm. Now around 600 kites feed every day over winter, probably less during the summer. It was 3 p.m. and the tractor was in place. The kites were flying lower now. With a 1.8 metre wingspan, hundreds of red kites swooping down right in front of you is an impressive sight. To describe it as a feeding frenzy would not be an exaggeration. With so many birds, I thought getting good clips of the kites would be easy. But they were all coming from behind the hive and rarely settling on the ground for more than a few seconds. The farmer went for a refill. With hundreds of kites still in the air, I tried to concentrate on individual birds, but it proved harder than I had hoped. I can sympathise with a peregrine having to pick out a wader from a massive flock. Eventually, I had some limited success. Paying a little extra, you could use a hide on top of the one I was in. This has a semi-open roof, allowing photographers to see approaching birds. This is probably the way to go for flight shots. And then the farmer was back. Once the farmer had left, the kites began staying on the ground a little longer. Still at a good distance, and with the company of rooks and crows. They started coming closer. Plenty of birds were still waiting their turn. By about 4:30, I had the hide to myself, and the birds were getting bolder. There are tagged birds. Soon they were getting even closer, and remaining on the ground even longer. I was getting full frame clips. And some even closer. Slightly further out, more kites were staying on the ground and searching for scraps. There is a theory that birds feeding at the end of a session are younger, weaker, or injured. This kite with a dodgy right eye seemed to uphold that theory. I stayed until almost 5, when the remaining kites were struggling to find even scraps. This one found nothing. With thunder rumbling, I got back to the car just as the heavens opened. We had to pull over almost as soon as we left. Great timing. After a disappointing morning at Innis here, the pied flycatchers and wood warblers had finished nesting and disappeared into the trees. We stopped at Diffie Nature Reserve before heading for Harlech Castle. Diffie is a nice little reserve, consisting mainly of reedbed with several large ponds. There is a well-manned elevated hide overlooking the osprey's nest. As you can see, there were 2 chicks. Ospreys have been nesting in Wales since 2004, and the site near Poor Maddock, where Ian went, is probably better, with 3 pairs now. Most of you will recognise the old timber jetty at Snettisham. It was a beautiful morning in early September, and I was there with a couple of friends to witness the high tide spectacular. The Wash is famous for the vast numbers of wintering waders and geese it attracts. On the highest tides, most of the birds in the southeast corner of the Wash are forced off of the mud, settling in the pits until the water retreats. If you haven't been, it's well worth getting out of bed at the crack of dawn to experience it. Get there as early as you can, as the car park fills very quickly and you don't want to miss any of the action. From the start, the birds were constantly relocating to keep ahead of the incoming tide. After a short while, some birds were already moving into the pits. Others were flying simply to find higher ground. These oyster catchers seem to have accomplished that. Many of the waders were not, and there are usually about 100,000 of them. The record is 140,000. You can see the closer birds, away from the incoming tide, are stationary. Those further back are rushing to keep ahead of it. The Latin name for knot, or red knot, is Calidris canutus, with reference to the story of King Canute sitting before the incoming tide in order to demonstrate that man has no control over the elements. Some stayed in the air for some time, creating sparkling clouds as the sun reflected off their moving bodies. Some joined these oyster catchers, heading for the pits. Many had given up the battle against the tide and were flying over in waves. The knot seemed more reluctant, relocating time after time. Then more began to join the oyster catchers. The remainder were marching in front of the tide. Or flying to relocate. or simply staying airborne. More and more waves of birds were flying our way, particularly oyster catchers. Suddenly there was an explosion of birds, with most of those remaining taken to the air. With so many birds flying over our heads, I didn't know which way to point the camera. Some of the movement is me trying to find the best composition. Thousands of birds were already flying over or descending into the pits. Many more seemed to be circling overhead, like aircraft at a busy airport, waiting their turn to land. I couldn't believe some people were even thinking of leaving, with so much happening. Many of the birds continued to circle overhead, some seeming to appear out of nowhere. Eventually, the tide had left no space for birds on the mud. The water had almost submerged the jetty, and it was time to see the gathering in the pits. We moved to the screen hide at the southern end of the pits. The oyster catchers were in their usual spot on the shingle bank. quite well spaced, and spilling into the water. Black-tailed godwits kept to the edge of the group, with their feet in the water. The screen hide was busy with other birders, so my view of the massive knot to the right was restricted. However, some birds were still arriving. There was an intermediate area between the oyster catchers and the knot, where the knot were trying to make it to their own side. Some birds already in the mass decided further up the pits would be more comfortable. Giving the in-betweeners the opportunity to take their place. Once on dry land, they seemed confused over where the best spot might be. And a few oyster catchers invaded the throng. There was a small group of spoonbill on the far bank. And a small group of redshank was joined by a young little ringed plover. Then the last knot joined his mates to the right of the oyster catchers. Further round at the new hide, we had a better view of the knot, tightly packed as they had been out on the mud. And those directly in front of the hide seemed even more tightly packed. There were birds in all phases of plumage. Many still in their rusty summer feathers, hence the name red knot. I was drawn to this group of three, with summer plumage on the left, winter plumage on the right, and a juvenile behind the winter bird. There were plenty of other species mixed in. The black and white wings and tail were a giveaway for the black-tailed godwit in the foreground. And right in front of the hide, a sleeping little stint. I didn't notice the bird hiding in front of the stint. I think it may have been the plover. There were plenty of black-tailed godwits in their soft grey winter plumage. Only a few retained some of their rufous summer plumage. I tried to turn these darker redshanks into spotted redshanks, but no, they were simply young birds. A lone oyster catcher had infiltrated the near side group of knot. A few birds were taking to the air again. There was still a lack of space between the knot compared with the oyster catchers. You will already have noticed dunlin amongst the throng. These were well scattered, many with their black summer bellies still. As the smallest waders present, they were easily pushed around by the others. Despite many birds still dozing, some were getting restless. Some of those took off for the mud again. This allowed an influx of larger birds to the fringes. Things seemed to settle for a while. I'd been finding a few bar-tailed godwits. This one didn't like being disturbed and chased an innocent redshank. Watching these dunlin, a piping call drew the attention of all the waders as a common sandpiper arrived. They nest mainly by rivers and lakes, in upland North and West Britain and Ireland, so we are only likely to see them here on migration. It appeared several times in front of the hide, searching the shoreline for worms and bobbing its tail characteristically. The white feathers rising up from the chest in front of the wing are another good field guide. The barring on the wing suggests a young bird. Back to the main group. This dunlin suddenly vacated its place as an egret came by. It continued along the shoreline. Eventually walking onto dry land, scattering the smaller birds in its wake. Some thought this was a good time to leave. Having cleared a space, the egret started to preen. There was a certain restlessness amongst the throng again. Birds were in the air further up the pits. This seemed to encourage most of the birds in front of the hide to join them, flying off for the mud and a meal. This left a small mixed group of godwits, curlew-like bar-tailed on the left, with noticeably larger black-tailed on the right, with longer beaks and legs, and uniform winter plumage. Only a thin band of knot remained. The young little ringed plover hunted the bank where thousands of waders had rested just a few minutes earlier. Some of the oyster catchers took to the air, joining a huge flock of knot from further up the pits. The remaining knot in front of the hide joined them too, leaving for refreshment.